If you're shopping for a small vehicle in America, there are more options now than there have ever been, especially if you're looking for a vehicle with a little bit of extra style or a little bit of extra practicality. And that's where the 2017 Hyundai Veloster comes in, because this is a four-door hatchback. You heard that right, I said four doors, not 5 doors or 3 doors. You can think of the Veloster as the sporty alternative to the Hyundai Accent. The pricing is not too far off where we see the Accent or the Elantra, but we have the practicality of that hatchback in the rear and a more sporty demeanor overall. You could also see this as an alternative to something like a Kia Soul, because interestingly enough, the Veloster and the very boxy Soul are actually very closely related vehicles. They just have two very different missions in mind. This is going after sporty styling and a sportier driving dynamic. The Soul is going after maximum cargo practicality. Up front we find Hyundai's distinctive grille, but in terms of overall proportion, this grille occupies a much larger area of real estate up front than we find in many Hyundai models. It gives the Veloster sort of a hungry appearance. We have these aggressive headlamp modules, projector beams for the low beams, reflectors for the high beams, LED strips right there inside, and a ring around that low beam module as well. Below the headlamp module we have fog lamps in this particular trim, and you'll see we have a blend of black and sort of matte metal effect trim right here on the grille. At 166 inches long, the Veloster is very solidly a subcompact vehicle in America. This is more than a full foot shorter than a Hyundai Elantra, which is already on the small side for the compact segment. As you'd expect from a subcompact vehicle, the price tag is also subcompact. It starts just over $18,000. So this is not a direct competitor to something like a Chevy Cruze hatchback or a Honda Civic hatchback. This really is in a category almost to its own. The Veloster is roughly the same size as a Honda Fit, and it's only 3 inches longer than the closely related Kia Soul. But as you can see, the overall style is sort of coupe meets hatchback. As I said earlier, this is a four-door vehicle. So over here on the passenger side, we have a door in the back, but we do not have a door in the back on the driver's side. In case you were wondering, this is sold in right-hand drive countries, but in those countries, the door is still on this side of the vehicle. Now the driver's side of the vehicle, it doesn't move places to the other side of the car. That means that at a casual glance, the Veloster looks symmetrical, but the one side is not actually like the other because we don't have that door over here. The aggressive styling that we see up front is mirrored out back, where we have this very large blacked out section of the rear bumper, large twin center exhaust tips, large tail lamp modules with light pipes that go from the front to the back of the module. Our model also has parking sensors in back, in addition to the backup camera that's right here below the Hyundai logo. And of course, we are driving the turbocharged version, so we have a turbo badge over here on the hatch. Looking at the rear end from the side, you'll notice that above the spoiler we have this very large rear window. When you're looking through the rearview mirror of the vehicle, you're looking a little bit through this window, but majorly through this lower window right here. Because the Veloster is sort of coupe meets hatchback, the hatchback opening actually starts way back here in the vehicle, just about over the rear passenger's knees, not the rear passenger's heads. Under the hood, things start out with a 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine producing 132 horsepower and 120 pound-feet of torque. That's fairly average for the subcompact segment. That engine is mated to either a 6-speed manual or a 6-speed dual-clutch transmission, and you'll get either 30 or 31 miles per gallon combined. The model we're driving is the Veloster Turbo, so Hyundai swapped out that 1.6-liter engine for a turbocharged 1.6-liter engine that also features direct injection. Power level jumps up to 201 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. You can still get it with a 6-speed manual, which is what we're driving right here, or you can get this one with a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. Even though power increases by a healthy 69 horsepower, fuel economy doesn't drop too far. It comes in at 28 miles per gallon combined if you get the manual, 29 with the automatic. Keeping in mind that this is a subcompact vehicle, I found these front seats surprisingly comfortable, and I'm going to give them 10 out of 10 points. They're not as adjustable as some of the electric seats that we do find in the subcompact segment, but electric seats are somewhat rare. We have a two-way electric lumbar support. The rest of the motions of this seat are manual, and we have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion. Even though this vehicle has a sporty mission and we have a moonroof, headroom is still relatively generous. Now the seat could move a little bit closer to the floor, but I prefer my seat to be a little bit more upright. We also have a steering column that pulls out a little bit closer to the driver than many vehicles out there. One of the things that I really like about these seats is the aggressive side bolstering. It's quite aggressive on the seat bottom cushion and on the seat back cushion. Now on the downside, if you're much larger than I am, you might find these seats uncomfortable, but for my 6-foot frame, I found these seats excellent. When you hop in the back, it's obvious that this is a subcompact vehicle, although I have to say that having this side door for the rear is a little bit more practical than the average two-door coupe, which makes getting into the back pretty tricky. Of course, once we're back here, we're not going to find that much more headroom. If I sit upright, I really can't see out to the side there. As you see, the sill is in the way, and my head is touching the rear glass. That's because the hatchback actually comes to right about here in the vehicle, not way back here where my head is actually. If I move over to the driver's side of the vehicle, this front seat was adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. You can see I have about an inch of legroom left. This other front seat was all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" passenger there, and that was where my knees were digging into the seat. The Veloster is a 4-passenger vehicle, so instead of a center seat, we have 2 cup holders and a very small storage cubby without a lid. Behind the hatch, you'll find 15.5 cubic feet of cargo space. This cargo area is very deep and very square for this category. You'll actually find more cargo space back here than many subcompact crossovers, even though this again is more of a coupe meets hatchback. Of course, I suspect that many shoppers of the Veloster will probably have this vehicle spend most of its time with the rear seats folded. We can take out this hard tonneau cover, right like that. And then if we fold the rear seats forward, they fold almost completely flat with the cargo area in the rear, and that gives us over 35 cubic feet of storage space, more than we find in many compact crossovers. The cargo area's shape and size is made possible by the rear suspension design in the Veloster. And if I lift up the cargo area load floor, you notice I have a little bit of extra storage space right here, and there's enough room if you wanted to put a donut spare tire in there yourself. When it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 9 out of 10 points. Even though this vehicle has less cargo capacity back here than you find in something like a Nissan Versa Note, this is a very different kind of vehicle because this really is trying to be a sportier 2-door coupe kind of vehicle rather than that more 5-door wagon. The cargo area is large, it's wide, and it is very square, which really improves practicality. We have a nicely placed handle right back here on the rear. As we look around the interior, keep in mind we are in a relatively top-end trim of the turbo model. We have this large moonroof that goes just to behind the driver and front passengers' heads. You can see there's a very little regular roof section, and then we have that large window right there above the rear passengers' heads. As we pan back towards the front, you'll see that rear door over there on the passenger side. An interesting thing that you'll notice if you look closely at the vehicle is that this B-pillar where the front seat belt is attached is actually in a different position on the driver's side and on the passenger side, and that's because of that rear door behind it. The front doors are a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. We have a soft touch insert right here, a soft touch armrest, this interesting large door handle right here to open and close the door, a storage cubby right there. The lower portion of the door is made from a hard plastic, and then the upper section sill right here is actually a hard plastic that has sort of a rubbery coating put on it. In addition to the rubbery coating, that top plastic trim and the top portion of the dashboard have an interesting pattern cut into them. The rubbery texture helps these sections feel more premium than they otherwise would, and it also helps reduce glare and reflections in the windshield. The dashboard has a very stylized design that's similar to what we see in other Hyundai models. Our model has the up-level audio system, so we have a center channel speaker. We also have a touchscreen infotainment and navigation system that features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. 2 air vents on either side, some direct access buttons on either side of the screen and below it. So we have our settings button and our info button right here. Below that, we have the controls for the single zone automatic climate control system and our heated seat controls. There's a very centrally mounted engine start-stop button, and then below that we have 2 power ports, USB and auxiliary input, and an area where you can put smartphones and other devices. As I said before, the model we're driving has the 6-speed manual transmission. Reverse is all the way over to the left and then up. Between the front seats, we have a handbrake, 2 large cup holders, and then a softly padded armrest, which opens in 2 stages. One where you can put wallets or smartphones or other small devices, and then another area that's a little bit deeper and has a 12-volt power port. The instrument cluster features black faces, white numbers, and red dials. There's a large tachometer on the left, large speedometer on the right, and then a multifunction display in between. The multifunction display is one of Hyundai's older designs, although it does allow us to adjust certain vehicle settings. It's primarily used for trip computer information. The steering wheel is a 3-spoke design with small sport grips up top. We have our volume, mode, and track up-down buttons on the left. In addition, we have some dedicated phone and voice command buttons. And then on the right side, we find the buttons for the cruise control and that multifunction display. 0 to 60 time varies depending on whether you get the manual or the automatic and whether you get the base 1.6 liter engine or the turbocharged engine that we're driving right here. Obviously, the non-turbo Veloster is not terribly swift. It's about the same 0 to 60 time as the Hyundai Accent. However, the Veloster Turbo is a very different kind of vehicle. There's a little bit more turbo lag out of this engine than we find in Honda's 1.5-liter turbo engine. However, this produces more power than most versions of Honda's 1.5. That helps this vehicle go from 0 to 60 notably faster than something like a Mazda CX-3. This will even go from 0 to 60 faster than a Mini Cooper. In fact, in terms of overall performance, this is right around the same as a Toyota FRS or Subaru BRZ. But this is not a Volkswagen GTI. That will go from 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds, and it's a very different kind of vehicle. The GTI is much more of a hardcore performance vehicle, and remember that the basis of the Veloster starts at just over $18,000. In our braking test, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 123 feet, which is pretty average for this particular segment. Handling comparisons are tricky because what is the Veloster and what does it compete with? You could compare this to something like that Mazda CX-3, in which case this is going to handle unquestionably better than the CX-3. Or you could also compare this to something like a Honda Fit. This is going to hold the road better than a Honda Fit, but it's not going to feel quite as engaging as that Fit. You could also compare this to the Mazda 2, which is not found directly in the US, but it is sold as a Toyota Yaris IA. The Yaris IA definitely has a more sorted handling feel than the Veloster out on the road, and a lot of it has to do with the rear suspension design. For my overall handling score, I'm going to give the Veloster an A because this is still an awful lot of fun. Grip is excellent in the turbo model. It's sort of middling in the base Veloster model. Keep in mind that base Veloster really is more of an alternative to a Hyundai Accent rather than a performance vehicle. The firm suspension and the overall design of the rear suspension is noticeable when we get this out on rougher roads, because this ride is definitely more punishing than your average subcompact crossover or subcompact hatch. Obviously, that's because of the very sporty mission we see in this vehicle. The model we're driving also has very low profile tires, and that means this transmits more of those small imperfections into the cabin. And finally, the design of the rear suspension, much like we see in the Hyundai Elantra or the Kia Soul, means that the rear suspension does feel a little bit upset when you start pushing this vehicle harder in the corners, especially on rougher pavement. The trade-off for that, of course, is that massive cargo area in the back, because if this had an independent rear suspension, the cargo area would be considerably smaller. In our cabin noise test, we scored 75 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which puts this towards the upper end of the subcompact segment in terms of interior noise. When it comes to fuel economy, we have been averaging 29 miles per gallon, which is one over what the EPA says we should get for this 1.6-liter turbocharged manual model. The fuel economy is likely the result of the relatively wide tires that we have on this vehicle, 225 width, and the fact that this is really not that much lighter than the Elantra. Even though the Elantra is about 14 inches longer than this is only about 70 pounds lighter. Before we discuss pricing comparisons, we need to talk about what the Veloster is, because again, this is sort of a performance and style hatchback meets coupe. It's not quite a traditional two-door coupe because we get that third door in the back and because of the overall proportion of the vehicle, but neither is it really a traditional hatchback. The aggressive styling that we see in the Veloster is also a key part of its design, as is the sporting mission of the turbo model. There used to be more direct competition in the United States for this sort of car. We used to have the Honda CR-Z, the Scion TC, and the Mazda 2 hatch, but we no longer get those vehicles in the US. Making things a little bit more complex is the way the Veloster is priced. It starts at $18,100. That's a fairly low sticker price, but it is more expensive than a base Elantra sedan and about $3,500 more than an Accent hatchback. The Veloster is a logical cross-shop in some ways to both the Accent hatchback and the Elantra hatchback. This is the kind of vehicle for someone that wants a little bit more practicality than an Elantra sedan, but they want the more sporty design that we see in the Veloster. And then, of course, as you can see, we have the Veloster Turbo at $21,600. That puts that model in a very different category from entries like a base Ford Fiesta hatchback or something like a Nissan Versa Note. The first sort of competitor we'll talk about is the 2018 Toyota Chr. This was designed as a small crossover vehicle for the Scion brand, but then, of course, Scion ended up being killed. Now, I know the CHR is billed as a crossover, but you really could look at this as sort of a style-forward coupe alternative, because Toyota decided to style the vehicle in a way to really accentuate the front doors, minimize the rear doors, and they have made it a fairly low-to-the-ground crossover kind of vehicle. In addition, it's available only in front-wheel drive. It's not an all-wheel drive vehicle, so it's more of a direct competitor to the Veloster than something like a Fiat 500X or a Jeep Renegade. And of course there's a price tag, which at $22,500 puts this right in there with the turbocharged Veloster. However, we definitely get less power in the Toyota. Out of its 2-liter engine, we only get 144. That means it's not really in the same performance range as the Veloster Turbo. Obviously, the Toyota is not going to be as fast as the Turbo Veloster, but it does surprise when it comes to handling. You can thank the wide tires we find in all models of the CHR, as well as the low-to-the-ground stance. Although the 500 is more of an upright 2-door hatch versus the more coupe-like shape that we find in the Veloster, they're both very style-forward vehicles. Because of the overall size of the 500, it obviously is going to have a more cramped back seat and a much smaller cargo area than we find in the Veloster. I also find the 500 less comfortable overall in terms of the general seat design, the way the interior is put together, where your legs hit the vehicle, etc. The 500 is also getting a little bit old. Now, I'm not saying that the Veloster is exactly a spring chicken, but its infotainment systems are much more modern than we find in the 500. In the 500, you cannot get an integrated factory infotainment system with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. It actually has a very, very basic infotainment system that probably belongs in the year 2000. That said, the Abarth is an awful lot of fun, but it is a little bit different than the Veloster, because I actually think the Veloster works best with its 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. It goes from 0 to 60 a little bit faster, it's easy to live with, the shifts are nice and fast. But when we take a look at the Abarth with the automatic transmission, it's a very different thing. I would definitely get the Abarth with the manual. The Abarth with the automatic is slower 0 to 60, and it's just not as much fun to drive. Next up, we have the Ford Fiesta, specifically the Ford Fiesta ST. Now, the rumor mill tells us that the Fiesta may be discontinued in the United States for 2018. So if you're interested in a Fiesta, you should definitely go out and buy one of the 2017s while they're around, especially if that discontinuation notice firms up later this year. At the moment, I think the Fiesta and the Fiesta ST are the closest competitors to the Veloster and the Veloster Turbo that we have in the US. We get almost as much power in the Fiesta ST, but it actually goes from 0 to 60 a little bit faster than the Veloster, thanks to the overall design of the Fiesta and the relative curb weight. If you're really good with the manual transmission, you can get the Fiesta ST from 0 to 60 in about 6.7 seconds, which means for most people it's going to be right around the same speed as the Veloster with the 7-speed dual clutch. At $21,140, it's also almost exactly the same price as the Veloster. However, as you add options to the Fiesta ST, it is going to be a little bit more expensive. Now, obviously, a 5-door hatchback is not quite the same thing as the 4-door hatchback form with the more coupe-like shape that we find in the Veloster, but you'll find relatively similar amounts of cargo room and relatively similar amounts of rear seat legroom. Rear seat headroom, on the other hand, is going to be better in the Fiesta because of its more traditional hatchback profile. Although Ford has tweaked a few things in the Fiesta over its time in the United States, the overall vehicle is starting to look a little bit dated, and it really shows when you sit behind the wheel and you take a look at the vehicle around you versus the Veloster's interior. Therefore, my top pick in this segment is going to be the Veloster Turbo, and again, I would get it with the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. Interestingly enough, my runner-up would actually be the Toyota Chr. Obviously, it's not a performance vehicle like the Fiesta ST or the Veloster or the Abarth. However, the CHR really did impress me when it comes to its handling ability. In addition to that, it's comfortable on the inside, and it's an excellent value. Be sure and let me know what you think about the Hyundai Veloster down there in the comments section below. Click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. You can also head over to facebook.com/AlexandAutos and find us over there and see what we're driving this particular week. And as always, if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, head over to patreon.com and look us up over there. I'll see you next week.